My son sat at the reading of the will with a smug smile, convinced that I would get nothing from his mother's $52 million inheritance. But when the lawyer read one single sentence, everything changed. The smile disappeared from Marcus's face, and he started screaming so loudly that the walls of the office shook. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The smoke alarm shrieked through my small apartment, piercing and relentless. I grabbed a dish towel and waved it frantically beneath the detector while my breakfast burned on the stove. 68 years old and still couldn't manage scrambled eggs without setting off alarms. "Mr. Harrison, are you okay in there?" Mrs. Chen's worried voice called through the apartment wall. "Just cooking, Mrs. Chen. Everything's fine." I scraped the blackened eggs into the trash and silenced the alarm. Through the kitchen window, I could see Seattle's skyline emerging from morning fog, the Space Needle pointing toward clouds that threatened rain. Another typical Northwest morning in the life of a retired firefighter who traded his turnout gear for sweatpants and grocery store reading glasses. The phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Probably another robocall about extended car warranties, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "William Harrison speaking." "Mr. Harrison, this is Richard Sterling from Sterling & Associates in Seattle. I'm calling regarding Catherine Morrison Harrison." My hand tightened around the receiver. Nobody had called Catherine by her married name in 13 years, not since the divorce, not since she'd legally reverted to Morrison and built an empire that made our 23 years of marriage seem like ancient history. "What about her?" "Sir, I'm very sorry to inform you that Miss Morrison passed away on Wednesday evening in a private plane crash near Vancouver. The funeral service is scheduled for this Saturday at 11 a.m. at Evergreen Memorial Chapel." The world tilted sideways. I sank into my kitchen chair, the familiar creak suddenly too loud. Wednesday evening, that was 4 days ago. 4 days while I'd been worrying about smoke alarms and whether my pension check had cleared. "Mr. Harrison, are you there?" "Yes." Yes." My voice sounded strange, hollow. "How did you get my number?" "Your name was listed in Mrs. Morrison's personal documents as an emergency contact. I understand you were previously married. 23 years reduced to past tense." "Yes, we divorced in 2012. "I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a party of interest, so your attendance would be appreciated." "Named? Why would I be named? Catherine and I haven't spoken in over a decade." "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details over the phone, Mr. Harris, but your presence is specifically requested in the will's execution documents." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and deliver different news. Catherine Morris, the woman who'd argued with a restaurant manager about gender discrimination on a rainy evening in 1988. The woman who'd said yes when I proposed with a ring that cost 2 months' salary. The woman who'd eventually looked at me with disappointment in her eyes and said, "William, I can't do this anymore." Dead at 65. Gone in a plane crash while I was burning eggs in a studio apartment that cost more than I could afford. The funeral was in 3 days. I had no idea why her lawyer wanted me there, but I knew with absolute certainty that my son Marcus would be furious when I showed up. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie I'd worn to exactly 3 events in the past 5 years. A cousin's wedding, a former colleague's retirement party, and now this. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. My hair had gone completely silver, face mapped with lines that told stories of 30 years fighting fires and 13 years living with regret. The navy suit hung slightly loose. I'd lost weight since retirement, the combination of modest budget and reduced appetite creating a body that looked diminished somehow. I thought about not going. Thought about calling Richard Sterling and explaining that my presence would only cause problems, that Marcus had made it abundantly clear I wasn't welcome in their world anymore. But Catherine had named me in her will for a reason, and despite everything that had gone wrong between us, I owed her the respect of showing up one final time. The drive to Evergreen Memorial took 40 minutes through Saturday traffic and rain-slick street. The chapel occupied prime real estate in Queen Anne, all modern glass and stone architecture that spoke of wealth and careful design. The parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles, Tesla Model S sedans, Range Rovers, a Porsche Cayenne that probably cost more than I'd earned in my best year. I parked my 12-year-old Toyota Camry at the far edge of the lot and sat for a moment, watching well-dressed people hurry through the rain toward the entrance. They moved with the confident purpose of people who belonged, who never questioned their right to occupy space. Inside, the chapel whispered money. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Puget Sound. Minimalist floral arrangements probably cost thousands. Seats upholstered in fabric too nice to call simple cloth. At least 300 people filled the space, their conversations creating a low murmur of business networking disguised as grief. I recognized some faces from the years when Catherine and I were still together, back when I'd accompany her to industry events and try not to feel out of place. But most were strangers from the tech world she'd conquered after leaving me behind. Venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, people whose LinkedIn profiles probably read like adventure novels. I found a seat in the back row, hoping to remain invisible, but whispers followed my arrival like smoke. Is that her ex-husband? What's he doing here? I heard he held her back for years. The stories had taken on their own mythology over the years. Apparently, I was the anchor who'd nearly drowned Catherine's potential, the small-minded firefighter who couldn't handle being married to someone destined for greatness. I'd learned long ago not to fight narratives that served other people's need for simple villains. Dad, the voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up to see Marcus striding down the aisle, every inch his mother's son. At 35, he'd inherited Catherine's sharp cheekbones and commanding presence, dressed in a Tom Ford suit that probably cost what I paid in rent for 3 months. Success radiated from him, expensive watch, perfect haircut, the kind of effortless confidence that came from never doubting your place at the top of the social hierarchy. He worked as an investment banker now, managing portfolios for people who considered millions a rounding error. Marcus, I'm sorry about your mother. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the chapel, drawing attention from nearby mourners. You weren't invited. The lawyer called me, said I was named in the will. That's ridiculous. Marcus moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. Mom wouldn't want you here. Not after everything. Maybe not, but I needed to pay my respects. Respects. His laugh was sharp, bitter. You lost the right to pay respects when you walked away from us. The familiar accusation landed like it always did, part truth, part distortion, entirely painful. Yes, I'd been the one to file for divorce, but only after years of watching Catherine drift further into a world where I didn't fit, where my working-class background and simple values became sources of embarrassment rather than shared foundation. Marcus, I don't want to cause problems. I'll sit in back. When the service ends, I'll leave quietly. You'll leave now. His voice rose, drawing more stares. This is a celebration of Mom's life and achievements. You represent everything she overcame to become successful. The words hit like fists. Everything she overcame, as if our 23 years together had been obstacles rather than partnership, as if the man who'd supported her first business loan had been burden instead of believer. Around us, the chapel had gone quiet. 300 pairs of eyes watched our confrontation like spectators at a car accident, horrified but unable to look away. I'm not leaving, Marcus. Your mother's lawyer specifically asked me to be here. For what? To collect some pathetic consolation prize, to remind everyone that she was once married to someone so ordinary. He turned to address the gathered mourners, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family." Few people nodded. Someone murmured agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but forced myself to remain calm. Starting a scene would only confirm every negative story they'd heard about me. "For those who don't know," Marcus continued, warming to his performance, "this is William Harrison, the man who spent 23 years being supported by my mother while contributing nothing to her success. While she was building Morrison Tech Ventures, he was content to fight fires and collect a pension." "Marcus, that's enough, is it? Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here." He gestured broadly to the crowd. "After the divorce, after taking half of everything Mom had worked for, he disappeared. No calls, no visits, no relationship with his own son. And now that she's gone and there might be money involved, suddenly he shows up expecting sympathy." Each word felt like a match being struck, small fires of shame igniting across my skin. Not because the words were entirely false, but because they reduced decades of complicated love and loss to a simple story of greed and inadequacy. I thought about defending myself, about explaining how I'd called Marcus dozens of times in those early years, how every attempt at connection had been rebuffed with coldness and accusations, how Catherine's success hadn't diminished my pride in her, even as it had revealed the growing chasm between our worlds. But what was the point? These people had chosen their story years ago. "My mother died building something that will change the world," Marcus concluded, his voice trembling with genuine emotion beneath the anger. "She deserved a partner who would have helped her reach those heights, not someone who tried to keep her small and manageable." The chapel fell silent. I sat there fully exposed under the weight of 300 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation, but another part, the part that had loved Catherine Morrison more than anything in the world, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Marcus's eyes flashed with surprise. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained seated, his confidence flickered. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 23 of them as her husband, 17 more as someone who wished her well despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because we made promises to each other that once meant something, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance. "The service will begin in 5 minutes, a voice announced from the front. The funeral director, probably trying to restore order. Marcus shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front row reserved for immediate family. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of continued gossip. Nerve showing up, poor Marcus having to deal with, should have stayed home, but I stayed. Stayed through the eulogy that painted Catherine as a visionary who'd overcome obstacles to achieve greatness. Through readings from tech industry leaders who spoke of her innovation and leadership. Through musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. Nobody mentioned the woman who'd cried in my arms after her first business failed. Nobody talked about the nights we'd stayed up late, planning and dreaming over kitchen table covered with spreadsheets. Nobody remembered the Catherine who'd once needed someone to believe in her before she learned to believe in herself. When it ended, people filed past offering condolences to Marcus, while pointedly ignoring me. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave. Mr. Harris, a man in an expensive charcoal suit, approached, mid-50s, carrying a leather briefcase. "Richard Sterling from Sterling and Associates." We spoke on the phone. "Could I have a word? If this story reminded you of the injustices you've seen, follow the channel and turn on notifications." Because wherever justice is delayed, a new revenge story begins. Marcus was already there, pacing like a caged animal, his face flushed with residual anger from our earlier confrontation. "Why is he here?" Marcus demanded when he saw me. "Whatever business we have can be handled without him." "Actually, it can't." Richard settled into a chair at the head of a small conference table, gesturing for us to sit. "Your mother's will specifically requires both of you to be present for its reading." "That doesn't make sense." Marcus remained standing. "Dad hasn't been part of our lives for 13 years. What could Mom possibly need him here for?" "Please, sit down." Richard's voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing emotional situations. "I understand this is difficult, but I have legal obligations to fulfill regarding your mother's final wishes." Marcus finally sat, choosing the chair farthest from me. I took the seat closest to the door, still half expecting to be asked to leave. Richard pulled a thick document from his briefcase, blue backing visible beneath the top page. "This is the last will and testament of Catherine Ann Morrison, executed on February 14, 2025, and properly witnessed according to Washington state law. 6 months ago, Catherine had updated her will just 6 months before the plane crash. I wondered what had prompted her to make changes, whether she'd had some premonition of mortality or simply the practical mindset of someone managing significant wealth. The will confirms that Mrs. Morrison was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared," Richard continued. "She underwent thorough legal and medical evaluation to ensure the validity of her wishes." Marcus leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. I could see the anticipation in his posture, a man preparing to finally claim his inheritance, to step fully into the empire his mother had built. "Let's start with specific bequests," Richard said, turning to the second page. "To my beloved son, Marcus William Harrison, I leave the penthouse condominium at Harbor Steps, including all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein." Marcus nodded. The Harbor Steps penthouse was worth at least $2.3 million, a stunning property with views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains, a substantial gift by any measure. Additionally, Richard continued, "I bequeath to Marcus the sum of $750,000 to be transferred from my primary investment accounts within 60 days of probate. $3 million in total." I watched Marcus's reaction carefully, noting how his smile flickered slightly. He was pleased, certainly, but I could see him calculating. Catherine's tech ventures were worth far more than $3 million. Where was the rest? Where was Morrison Tech Ventures? "That's very generous," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "But what about Mom's business interests?" "The company." Richard set down the first page and lifted the second, his expression remaining professionally neutral. "I'm continuing with the specific bequests. Please allow me to finish." The room felt suddenly smaller, air heavier. I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly like an intruder, witnessing something private. Marcus was receiving millions more money than most people saw in several lifetimes. It seemed appropriate, natural. He was Catherine's son, the person she'd groomed to understand her world. "The bequest to Marcus," Richard continued, "includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued pursuit of work that serves others rather than solely personal enrichment. Should Marcus choose to remain in investment banking focused exclusively on wealth management for high net worth individuals, the inheritance will be held in trust until such time as he demonstrates commitment to more socially beneficial work." Marcus's face went white. "What? Mom wouldn't put conditions on my inheritance. That doesn't make sense." "I'm reading the will as written, Marcus. These are your mother's words, not mine." The confident anticipation had drained from Marcus's expression, replaced by confused anger. "So she's trying to control my career from beyond the grave." trying to force me into some bleeding heart nonprofit work. Your mother's will doesn't specify what constitutes socially beneficial work, Richard said calmly. Only that your inheritance is contingent upon demonstrating that your career serves purposes beyond wealth accumulation. I watched this exchange with growing confusion. Why would Catherine put conditions on Marcus's inheritance? What message was she trying to send? This is insane, Marcus muttered. Absolutely insane. Richard turned to another page, and something in his expression made my stomach tighten. A slight hesitation, a careful breath, the mannerisms of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. However, he said, his voice taking on additional weight, the will contains additional provisions regarding the disposition of Mrs. Morrison's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate. Marcus straightened in his chair. Finally, let's hear about the company and her primary holdings. Richard's eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw something there. Sympathy, perhaps, or professional obligation mixed with personal discomfort. To my former husband, William James Harrison, he read, his words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. I bequeath the sum of $51.5 million to be transferred from my investment portfolio and corporate holdings. The world stopped. Marcus's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he shot to his feet. What did you just say? I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. $51.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real, didn't seem to apply to someone like me sitting in a lawyer's office in Seattle. Additionally, Richard continued, his voice steady despite the building storm, I transferred to William Harrison controlling interest in Morrison Tech Ventures, including all subsidiary companies and technology patents. This transfer includes 68% ownership of all corporate entities and appointment as chairman of the board of directors. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling like I might fall despite being seated. Morrison Tech Ventures, the company Catherine had built from nothing into a technology empire worth hundreds of millions. She was giving me control of everything. This is impossible. Marcus's voice came out as a strangled sound somewhere between rage and disbelief. She wouldn't. She couldn't. I assure you the documents are legally sound, Richard said calmly. No! The word exploded from Marcus like a gunshot. This is fraud. He manipulated her somehow. Got to her when she was vulnerable. I finally found my voice, though it came out weak and uncertain. Marcus, I swear to you I haven't spoken to your mother in 13 years. Liar. He slammed his palms on the table, hard enough to make the water glasses jump. Nobody gives away $50 million to their ex-husband for no reason. Richard removed his glasses, cleaning them with methodical precision. Marcus, please sit down. Your mother left a personal message explaining her decision. Perhaps that will help you understand. A message? Marcus's laugh was wild, unhinged. She left him a message but cut me out of everything that matters. You received a substantial inheritance, Richard replied. $3 million is more than compared to $52 million. Marcus pointed at me with a shaking finger. You're telling me she left him everything and gave me table scraps with conditions attached. The magnitude of what had happened was starting to penetrate my shock. Catherine hadn't just remembered me in her will. She'd made me wealthy beyond anything I'd ever imagined. More than that, she'd given me her company, her life's work, the empire she'd valued above our marriage. None of it made sense. Mr. Sterling, I managed to say, there must be some mistake. Why would Catherine do this? She left specific instructions addressing that question. Richard pulled an envelope from his briefcase, Catherine's distinctive handwriting across the front. She asked me to read this personal message after announcing the inheritance. Marcus stared at the envelope like it might explode. I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, shock transforming into desperate hope that the letter would explain away this impossible situation. Read it, Marcus whispered. Read whatever excuse she came up with for destroying everything. Richard opened the envelope carefully, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. When he began reading, Catherine's voice filled the room, and for a moment she was alive again. My dearest William, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Richard's office, wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. Richard's voice filled the room as he read Catherine's words, and despite everything, the years of separation, the divorce, the silence, hearing her speak through the letter, made my chest tighten with loss. My dearest William, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Richard's office, wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face right now, that expression you used to get when I'd reorganize the garage without warning. Confused, but trying to be polite about your confusion. Despite everything, I felt my lips curve into the ghost of a smile. She'd captured that expression perfectly, the one I'd worn countless times during our marriage, when she'd make sudden changes that left me scrambling to adapt. I know this inheritance comes as a shock, Richard continued reading. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But William, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Marcus made us sound like a wounded animal, but Richard kept reading. I never stopped loving you, not during our worst fights, not during the divorce proceedings, not during these 13 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. The words hit me like physical blows. Tears started, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and questions crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. You tried to save us, William. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered beyond quarterly earnings and board meetings. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. I told myself you were holding me back, that your contentment with a firefighter's life was proof of limited vision. But you weren't limited. You were wise. You understood something I'd forgotten, that success without love is just expensive loneliness. I wiped at my eyes, not caring how it looked. Marcus stared at the letter with an expression caught between rage and desperate pain. Marcus, Richard read, and my son's head snapped up. My beautiful, brilliant boy, I know you're furious right now. Probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. That's not true, Marcus whispered, his voice cracked. You've lived your entire adult life surrounded by wealth, accepting its benefits without understanding its responsibilities. You've never had to build something from nothing, never had to make hard choices between comfort and conscience. More importantly, you've spent 13 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed. Marcus's hands were shaking on the table. I wanted to reach out to him, to somehow bridge the chasm that Catherine's words were revealing, but I didn't know how. William taught me about character, Richard continued, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love, but I never forgot the man who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring about dignity or appearances. Catherine's words were rebuilding something inside me that I'd thought was permanently broken, the sense that I had value, that my quiet life of service meant something. The conditions I've placed on Marcus's inheritance aren't punishment, the letter continued. They're a gift, the gift of discovering who he might become when he's not cushioned by unlimited wealth, the gift of learning to build rather than inherit, to serve rather than consume. What would you do at this point? Write it in the comments. Your thoughts are as important as the story itself. Marcus slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked smaller, suddenly younger, more like the confused boy I'd tried to father than the hostile stranger he'd become. William, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this, because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. Richard paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. The rain had intensified outside, creating a steady rhythm against the windows that felt appropriate for this moment of reckoning. I've watched you from a distance these 13 years, William. Don't look so surprised. I hired a private investigator, not to interfere, but to know that you were okay. I know about your volunteer work at the senior center. I know you still donate half your pension to the firefighters' widows fund. I know that Miss Chen in your building calls you when her sink backs up because you're the only one who fixes it without charging her. My face flushed. The idea that Catherine had been watching my small, ordinary life felt both touching and mortifying. That's character, William. That's the kind of wealth that actually matters, and that's why I'm trusting you with everything I built. Not because you'll run the company the same way I did, but because you'll run it better. You'll remember that technology should serve people, not the other way around. Richard turned to the final page, his voice softening slightly. Marcus, I hope someday you'll understand that I loved you enough to give you the harder gift, the gift of discovering your own strength, your own purpose, your own capacity for goodness that has nothing to do with your last name or your bank account. To both of you, I'm sorry for the pain my choices caused. William, I'm sorry I made you feel small when you were the biggest-hearted person I ever knew. Marcus, I'm sorry I raised you to measure success in dollars instead of impact. If you're reading this together, as I've requested, then perhaps this is a chance to rebuild what I broke. Not the marriage that ship has sailed, but the family. The relationship between a father and son that got lost somewhere between my ambition and your pride. Take care of each other, and William, take care of my company. Transform it into something that would make us all proud. With love that transcended even my stupidity, Catherine. Richard folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table between us. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rain and Marcus's uneven breathing. I sat with tears on my cheeks, holding the knowledge that Catherine had loved me until the end, that she'd been watching over me, that she'd understood what I'd tried to tell her all those years ago about what actually mattered in life. Marcus stared at the table, his entire worldview crumbling around him. The confident investment banker who'd publicly humiliated me at the funeral was gone, replaced by something raw and confused. I don't understand, he finally said, his voice small. I did everything she wanted. I went to the right schools, took the right jobs, became successful by every measure she cared about. How is that not enough? The question hung in the air, and I realized with sudden clarity that this moment was why Catherine had required us both to be here. Not just to announce the inheritance, but to force a conversation that was 13 years overdue. Marcus, I said softly, your mother didn't think you weren't enough. She thought the life she'd pushed you toward wasn't enough. That doesn't make sense. She built that life. She valued that life. Until she didn't. I wiped my eyes, trying to find the right words. Your mom spent the last years of our marriage chasing something she thought would make her happy. Money, success, recognition, and she got all of it. Built an empire that made her one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest. Exactly. So why? But it didn't make her happy, Marcus. That's what this letter is telling us. She achieved everything she thought mattered and realized she'd lost the things that actually did matter. Marcus looked up at me, really looked at me, for the first time since I'd entered the chapel. His eyes were red, his face pale, all the practiced confidence stripped away. She mentioned watching you, he said quietly. The volunteer work, the donations, she was watching me too. I know she was. Of course she was. You're her son. Then she saw. He stopped, swallowed hard. She saw what I'd become, someone who measures everything in dollars, someone who considers $3 million table scraps when most people would consider it life-changing wealth. Richard had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke gently. Your mother believed you had the capacity to become more than what you currently are, Marcus. That's why she structured the inheritance this way. And what am I supposed to do now? Marcus's voice carried genuine anguish. Walk away from my career? Start over? I'm 35 years old. You're supposed to choose, I said. Choose what kind of person you want to be. Choose whether money or meaning matters more. Choose whether to spend the rest of your life resenting this moment or learning from it. Easy for you to say, You just inherited $52 million. You think that makes this easy? I gestured at the letter, at Richard, at the impossible situation we found ourselves in. Marcus, I don't know anything about running a tech company. I don't understand venture capital or software development or any of the things your mother built her empire on. This inheritance terrifies me. Then why did she give it to you? Because she trusted me to figure it out. Because she believed I'd prioritize the right things. Because I paused, realizing the truth as I spoke it. Because she wanted to teach us both something. Me, that I have value beyond what I always thought were my limitations. You, that there's more to life than what you've been chasing. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the rain continued its steady assault on Seattle. The sound was gray and choppy, whitecaps visible even from this distance. I've spent 13 years hating you, he said without turning around, blaming you for the divorce, for not being the husband Mom deserved, for holding her back from her potential. I know, but this letter, he pressed his forehead against the glass. She's saying I was wrong, that you were right all along about what mattered. Not right, just different. Your mom and I wanted different things, valued different things. Neither of us was wrong, we just became incompatible. He turned to face me and I saw genuine confusion in his expression. How are you not angry with me? After everything I said at the funeral, after all these years of shutting you out? The question deserved an honest answer. Because you're my son, Marcus, and because I understand that your mother's success and my ordinariness created an impossible situation for a kid trying to figure out which parent to emulate. It wasn't impossible. I should have, his voice cracked. I should have called you back after the divorce. You tried to reach out and I was so angry. You were 22 years old and your world was falling apart. You're allowed to have been angry. Richard cleared his throat gently. Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt this moment, but there are practical matters we need to address. The transfer of assets will take several weeks to complete. William, you'll need to meet with the Morrison Tech Ventures Board of Directors. Marcus, we'll need to discuss the conditions of your inheritance and how to document compliance. The business matters felt surreal after the emotional intensity of Catherine's letter. But Richard was right. Someone had to handle the logistics of transforming lives with the stroke of a pen. Can I ask you something? Marcus said suddenly, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. What are you going to do with the company, with all that money? I'd been asking myself the same question since Richard first announced the inheritance. Honestly, I have no idea, but I know what I'm not going to do. What's that? I'm not going to let it change who I am. I'm still going to fix Mrs. Chen's sink when it backs up. I'm still going to volunteer at the senior center. I'm still going to be the same person your mother apparently thought was worth remembering. That's it? You inherit $52 million, and your big plan is to keep being ordinary? Is that so bad? Being ordinary? Marcus studied me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite acceptance, but maybe the beginning of understanding. Subscribe and stay tuned so you don't miss any true revenge stories. Sometimes, even silence is the strongest form of revenge. Mom's letter said I should learn to build something instead of just managing other people's money. What would you want to build? If money wasn't the primary consideration. He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the rain-soaked city. I used to think about teach economics, maybe, or business ethics, helping kids who come from nothing understand that they can create something meaningful. That sounds worthwhile. It pays terrible, he laughed, but without the bitterness I'd heard earlier. Teachers make maybe $60,000 a year. I'm making 10 times that now, but would it make you happy? I don't know. I've never really thought about happiness as a valid metric for career decisions. Maybe that's exactly what your mother wanted you to think about. Richard gathered his papers, preparing to conclude our meeting. William, I'll have my assistant contact you next week to schedule meetings with the board. There's also the matter of Catherine's personal effects, photographs, letters. items she wanted you to have, personal effects, the physical remnants of a life that had ended too soon. Of course. Thank you, Richard. Marcus, we'll need to set up a separate meeting to discuss the trust structure and requirements for releasing your inheritance. Marcus nodded, still looking stunned by everything that had happened in this room. As we stood to leave, I found myself facing my son across the conference table, both of us transformed by the past hour in ways we were only beginning to understand. Marcus, I said quietly, I know this doesn't fix 13 years of distance, but maybe we could have coffee sometime. Talk about things that don't involve lawyers or wills or money. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the war playing out behind his eyes. Pride versus curiosity, anger versus exhaustion. The comfortable narrative he'd built about our family versus the complicated reality Catherine's letter had revealed. Yeah, he finally said. Yeah, I'd like that. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even quite peace, but it was possibility, and after 13 years of silence, that felt like a miracle. 3 months later, I stood in the boardroom of Morrison Tech Ventures, looking out at Seattle's skyline and wondering what Catherine would think of the changes I'd already begun implementing. The board had been skeptical at first, a retired firefighter with no business experience, suddenly in charge of a company worth hundreds of millions. But I'd brought something they hadn't expected: moral clarity and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about whether their projects served humanity or just shareholders. The proposed AI surveillance system for the Taiwanese government, I'd said at my first board meeting, generates substantial revenue. But does it align with our values? Are we comfortable profiting from technology that could be used to suppress dissent? The room had gone silent. Apparently, previous leadership hadn't asked such questions. Mr. Harrison, the CFO, had finally said, "That's a $20 million contract." I understand, but is it the right contract? Does it make the world better or just our bank account larger? We'd canceled the deal. The board had been furious. The stock price had dipped briefly, but then something unexpected happened. Talent started flowing toward us instead of engineers and developers who'd left for competitors because they were tired of ethically questionable projects began reaching out, interested in working for a company that asked whether something should be built before asking whether it could be built. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Coffee at our usual spot? Got some news to share. Our usual spot? In 3 months, we'd developed a routine Saturday morning coffee at a small cafe in Fremont, where we'd talk about everything except money and the past. We talked about books, about his girlfriend Sarah who taught middle school, about my discovery that I actually enjoyed learning about technology when it was explained patiently. Last week he'd mentioned that he was talking to the dean at Seattle University about a teaching position. The pay cut would be significant, but Sarah was supportive, and with his inheritance accessible once he made the transition, money wouldn't be a concern. You'd be good at it, I'd told him. You have your mother's gift for explaining complex concepts in ways people can understand. He'd smiled, a real smile, not the sharp corporate expression I'd seen at the funeral. That's the first time you've said I'm like Mom and it doesn't feel like an accusation. She was brilliant, Marcus. Just because we couldn't make our marriage work doesn't mean I didn't recognize her gift. Now, standing in her boardroom, making decisions she'd trusted me to make, I felt connected to Catherine in a way I hadn't since our divorce. Not romantic. That door was permanently closed. But something deep, a partnership that transcended the limitations of our marriage, built on shared values we'd both lost sight of for different reasons. Mr. Harrison, my assistant, poked her head into the boardroom. The team from the Children's Hospital is here to discuss the medical software grant. I smiled. This was my favorite part of the new role, using Morrison Tech's resources to solve problems that had no profit margin but enormous human value. We were developing free software for pediatric hospitals, creating educational tools for underfunded schools, building infrastructure for communities that had been ignored by the tech boom. Catherine's fortune was becoming a force for good just as she'd hoped it would. "Send them in," I said. As the team entered, I caught my reflection in the boardroom window. Silver-haired, dressed in a suit I'd finally learned to wear comfortably, standing in a building worth more than I'd ever imagined owning. But underneath it all, I was still the firefighter who'd fallen in love with a woman, arguing about gender discrimination in a restaurant. Still the man who believed character mattered more than credentials. Still the father who'd never stopped hoping his son might someday understand that love didn't require agreement, just acceptance. Catherine had given me more than money. She'd given me validation that the person I'd always been, the one she'd sometimes made me feel ashamed of, was exactly who I should have been all along. And in doing so, she'd given Marcus something even more valuable, the chance to discover who he might become when he stopped chasing someone else's definition of success. That evening, sitting across from my son at our usual coffee shop, watching him talk excitedly about his interview at Seattle University, I felt something I hadn't felt in 13 years. I felt like a family. Not the family we'd been before the divorce. Not the family Catherine had envisioned when she was building her empire. But a family nonetheless, imperfect, rebuilding, learning to measure worth in kindness rather than dollars. "Dad," Marcus said suddenly, using the word naturally for the first time since I'd arrived at the funeral, "I've been thinking about something Mom wrote in that letter." "Yeah?" she said. "You taught her about character, about integrity." He stirred his coffee, not meeting my eyes. "I want you to teach me those things too, not the business stuff. I can learn that anywhere. But the stuff that actually matters, the stuff I missed while I was busy measuring everything in profit margins." I felt tears prick at my eyes for the second time in 3 months. "Marcus, I'd be honored." "Good, because I'm going to need help figuring out how to be the kind of teacher who changes lives instead of just delivering information, and how to use the inheritance Mom left me in ways that would actually make her proud." We talked until the cafe closed, father and son rebuilding a bridge that had been burned 13 years ago. Outside, Seattle glittered with the lights of innovation and ambition. Inside, we discovered something Catherine had tried to tell us through her final gift, that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, about showing up even when you were uncertain, about choosing connection over pride, meaning over money, character over convenience. Catherine Morrison had died in a plane crash, leaving behind a fortune and a final lesson. The fortune would change lives through the work her company could do, but the lesson, that one elegant, devastating, beautiful lesson about what actually matters in life, that would change generations. 3 months ago, I'd been a retired firefighter, burning eggs in a studio apartment. Today, I was the chairman of a major tech company, guardian of $52 million, and father to a son who was finally ready to know me. The journey between those two realities had been painful, surprising, and ultimately redemptive, just like Catherine had planned it to be. Thank you for watching. If this story showed you a different face of justice, like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next revenge story.